Hello and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, which is brought to you in partnership with Kincentric, our partners, and we will be discussing the topic employee experience, key to organizations maintaining and unleashing productivity during and post-COVID-19 era. My name is Hiba Abbasi, and on behalf of the University of Manchester Middle East Center, I would like to welcome you all and thank you for taking the time to join us today. We are very delighted to be joined by our guest speakers from Concentric. So please, everyone, welcome Elias Deeb. He's the market leader in the Middle East. Stephen Hickey, Head of Culture and Engagement, Asia Pacific and Middle East, and Audrey Widjaja, Market Leader, China. Audrey, Stephen, and Elias, it's a pleasure to have you with us today. Before we start the session, I would like to remind our guests of a few housekeeping rules. You are all muted just to eliminate noise. So if you have any questions, please type them in the question box in your control panel and also in the chat box, and we will be answering them towards the end of the session in the Q&A section. This session is being recorded and will be shared with you all tomorrow. My colleague Ankita from the University of Manchester will also be joining the session. She also, hello Ankita. So now the session is about to start, and I'll pass it on to you, Elias, welcoming you and welcoming Stephen and Audrey.
Thank you very much, really appreciate it. And it's our pleasure to be here today. Allow me first to introduce Kincentric. Kincentric is a Spencer Stuart company. In fact, we aim to help organizations identify what drives their people so they can drive their business. Formerly, we were part of Aon Consulting, and we've been in the market for the last 50 years. And as you notice from my colleagues who are on the call today with me, we come backed by a global network of colleagues, insights, and technologies, which allows us to help organizations accelerate success. So what do? We provide services and we help organizations through three main practices, basically. The first one being our leadership assessment and development practice, whereby we help organizations identify, assess, coach, and develop their leadership talent. Our second practice is our culture and engagement, where Kincentric helps organizations measure and manage their employee engagement and employee experience in a way that retain great people and help them deliver the best results. Our third practice is our HR and talent advisory practice, and this is the practice that assists organizations optimize the HR function to ensure that it is fully focused on driving the business and talent strategies. Today, we are going to be talking about the employee experience during the era and post the era of COVID-19. So, as Kincentric, what have we been seeing in the market so far? You all know the last few months have been really challenging. Many employees experienced isolation, some people experienced loneliness, some felt exhausted or even tired. However, what we noticed is that many organizations did extraordinary things as they rose to the occasion during this crisis. There has been significant leadership outreach, and firms stayed connected. They tried to be transparent, open, and even empathetic with their employees. We also witnessed that employee engagements levels were at a high. We've seen a lot of spikes in many occasions. However, we are a bit cautious that some of these spikes might be short-term or artificial, meaning that higher engagement levels are based at the moment on short-term reaction rather than being sustainable over the long term. If we look backwards a decade, if we look backward to the recession in 2009, we noticed that in the following year, employee engagement levels have dropped due to many organizations collapsing, due to layoffs, due to cost-cutting experiences that affected the various employee experiences as well. So In the last few months, we also have observed forced transformation. These transformations were forced by whatever was happening in the market. And this happened across geographies and across industries. And some CEOs have told us so far that the amount of change management that got implemented during COVID-19 by their organization would have taken them 3 years to achieve under normal circumstances. In fact, we've seen a lot of leadership buy-in to the need for change. We've seen detailed change plans being put in place. We've seen resources being provided by the organizations. Communication with the employees was continuous by their leadership. The levels of change acceptance was also relatively high. And if you look at social media on an ongoing basis, you notice that success stories were continuously shared. We are definitely expecting also major post-pandemic transformation to continue. And this is going to be necessary and survival-driven. Most organizations are not only planning to returning to the new normal that we're going to be experiencing, but also they're looking seriously into reviewing their business strategy. So this is definitely going to impact the employees and the employee experience in a monumental way, and leaders need to be equipped to lead their firms into recovery. Balancing the happiness of work-life balance, change, and the new working conditions will be front and center for individuals and for the organizations. Understanding the moments that matter to the different employee segments is more important than ever. So I'm going to leave the floor now to my colleague, Stephen. Stephen, can you please elaborate on the employee experience during the last few months under COVID-19?
I sure can. Thanks, Elias. And hi, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever we might find you in the world today. And we certainly hope that you're all safe and well for you and all of your families and friends in what's a really difficult time. And thank you for welcoming us into your homes today, and welcome to all of our homes and work environments. It's a great question, Elias. You know, what we're definitely seeing is that COVID-19 is an employee experience that people need to be led through. And it's having a profound effect on how individuals relate to their organization. And that's showing up in a number of different ways around how people experience an organization's approach to health and safety and wellness and colleague care, and how an organization helps people to connect and collaborate. There's obviously a lot of information that people need to receive from their leaders now to lead them through the crisis. A lot of people with anxiety about job security, financial wellness, and all these sorts of things. So this is a profound experience that people are going through. And you know, what is true is that people are having these experiences. I think the question for organizations is around, are people having the kind of experience that you would want them to have? And that will really come down to the practices that the organization is implementing in response to the crisis. And as Elias alluded to, we have seen through our client research data some really positive findings in terms of employees with very strong positive perceptions of how they're being led through this crisis. And we'll elaborate on that as we go through the conversation today. What we saw coming into the crisis, if we think about this notion of how do you take an employee experience-led approach to leading people through and coming out of the crisis, is that employee experience was certainly a great source of competitive advantage for organizations. And we'd expect the same to be true through the crisis and coming out of the crisis. And it'll be those organizations that do a better job of managing the experience of people through the crisis that we feel will help them to rebound faster than others. And those organizations that put people at the center of their thinking will be best placed to rebound quickly. And I think most importantly, be able to rebound safely, given the fact that we're all going to have to continue to think about colleague safety and health and wellness for a lot longer as we continue to understand more about the pandemic and everybody races towards a vaccine and so forth. So what I thought we might do in this conversation is share with you what we're seeing in our client research data around the state of play in terms of the experiences that people are having as they're being led through the first few months of the COVID-19 crisis, and then how you can all use employee experience thinking inside of your organization to lead people through the crisis and then hopefully lead people out of the crisis and make a really strong and fast rebound. We also want to make this really collaborative for all of you and give everybody the chance to input and have a say in the conversation. So we want to gather some feedback from all of you at the beginning. So we've got a couple of polling questions which just help us to set the scene and will help me steer the conversation in a few relevant ways to make it as applicable to all of you and where the participant group is thinking right now. So moderator, I might just ask if we can launch the first polling question on screen, and we'll encourage everybody to participate, and then we'll see the results as they come through, and I'll work them into some of the conversation that we have from this point.
Sure.
Thanks. So the question is, during the last 3 months, thinking about your organization and how it's managed to create impactful moments that have mattered for you as an employee. So just think about the last 3 months inside of your organization. To what extent has your organization managed to create some sense of impactful moments that have mattered to you as an employee? And I'll give everybody maybe 30 seconds to respond, and then I'll ask that we close the panel, and we'll see the results of the group. Okay, so maybe just 10 more seconds to reflect on your organization's approach to creating impactful moments that have mattered for you through this crisis. Okay, so moderator, we might just close the poll and let's see where everybody is at. And we're very deliberate in the language around impactful moments. Impactful moments is a really core part of the science behind experiences, which I'll talk about in a moment. So wow, look at this, 62% of people. So the vast majority of participants on the call agree that in the last few months, their organization has managed to create a number of impactful moments that have mattered to them. And you know, that's really heartening. And I'll elaborate on that finding in just a moment. But we have a second polling question for everybody. So moderator, I might just ask if we can show the second question, and then we'll move it forward on the slide deck, Elias. So second question is, from the 5 options below, which 2 of these has your organization mainly focused on during the last 3 months in its response to the COVID-19 crisis? So has the focus been on creating a connection between individuals and teams, or maybe it's been more on looking after personal wellness and well-being, or around communication from senior leaders, taking the right decisions, and finally flexible and virtual working arrangements? Just pick the 2 that you think best describe your organization's primary response over the last 3 months. And we'll just give everybody another 10 seconds to make the selection. Okay, moderator, let's maybe close it there just to keep things moving along, and let's see which responses were most common across the participant group. So there we go, connection between individuals and teams, big focus on flexible working arrangements. That's not a surprise, given that was something that, I guess, bar a small number of essential workers and a number of different job types where flexible working isn't so much of an option, but certainly for anybody in some sort of corporate role, flexible working arrangements certainly became the norm very, very quickly. So big focus on flexible work, big focus on connection between people, and a really big focus on information flow communication as well. So that's interesting. So let's pick up on those themes. So we might just move the conversation along, and we'll just revert to the slide deck. So Elias, if we can just bounce it forward a little bit, maybe one more as well. Thanks. So we're going to talk about how to take an employee experience-led approach to leading people through and coming out of the crisis. So I think to do that well, we have to ground ourselves in a really solid understanding of some of the science behind experiences. And there's really three key ways to think about this. Defining experiences. So these are experiences that make a really big impact on us. So we were very deliberate in our language there about impactful moments in that first polling question. There's really two conditions that make an experience a defining one. They are meaningful and they are memorable. So if we think about the COVID-19 crisis, I'd argue that by default, this is going to be a memorable experience. We've never seen anything like it. We're going to be telling this story to our kids and our grandkids, and it's going to live for a very long time. So I think by default, this is a memorable experience. I think the question for organizations is, how do you make it meaningful? And therefore, how do you make it meaningful in the positive as much as possible? You know, if there's going to be so much grief and there's so much negativity that's coming from this as we look at it simply from a healthcare perspective, but we also want to, make sure we find some good in all of this and use it as a force for lasting change. So that's the challenge for organizations, is how to make this a meaningful experience for people. So if we look at meaningful and memorable experiences, the science would tell us and the research would tell us they tend to happen at three moments. They tend to happen at these points of peaks and pits. So peaks are points of high, and pits are obviously points of low. And we want to maximize the peaks and minimize the pits, obviously. They also happen at points of milestones. So milestones traditionally are things like a work anniversary or a birthday. In the COVID-19 sense, I think a milestone experience for many of us will be when we get to go back into the work office. It might be when we get to welcome back a lot of people who were furloughed or put on long-term leave or anything like that. How we welcome those people back into the work experience is potentially a moment that matters and a defining moment for those people. And then there's transition. So in the pre-COVID world, transitions are things like transitioning from one job to another, or maybe it's a promotion. In the COVID-19 scenario, it was the transition to virtual work. Who would have thought that it was possible that millions of workers right the way around the world were able to transition to working from home and to make that transition happen literally overnight. But, we've found a way to make it happen. So that's really important to understand when these memorable and meaningful experiences are most likely to happen. And then we want to talk about how to make them happen. And the research would tell us there's four ways in which these experiences show up. They show up in this sense of connection between people. They show up in this greater sense of pride and advocacy. They show up in this sense, in this moment of insights, when we get true and rich insight that becomes an aha moment for us. That can create a meaningful and memorable experience. And it can also show up in this sense of elevation. The other way in which it can show up is in this sense of the removal of friction. What's interesting around, I think, the COVID-19 experience is it's definitely accelerating two core experiences, and it actually came out in the response pattern to the polling questions there. We are definitely seeing greater experiences around this sense of connection between individuals. We've all had to work harder to create a sense of connection as we do it through video conferencing and all these methods that we've had to revert to. And we are definitely seeing organizations double down on how to remove friction in systems and policies and processes, given we are all now doing work in a very, very different way. So we've rapidly seen investment in technology and tools and processes that are really trying to take friction and frustration out of how work gets done, because the way in which we're working now has just been so quickly and massively disrupted. So that's a little bit of grounding in some of the background and science to experiences. Let's now have a look at how this is showing up in the work experience of a couple of 100,000 people that we've been gathering feedback data on globally. what we've learned, so we asked for feedback from over 100,000 people globally, and we've got some really interesting findings into their work experience. So what we're seeing is that senior leadership and this notion of care and concern are the #1 driver of people's perceptions of feeling safe and healthy and well through this crisis. So that's really, really important. And I think that also shows up in this notion of leaders driving a sense of connection and care in terms of how they're leading people. So that's the first big theme that we've seen show up. We've seen that the vast majority of people have got very favorable ratings for their organization on how they're being led from the perspective of a priority being put on wellness, this notion of connection and caring, how senior leaders have become more visible and available and accessible with really good, frequent information, and a really big focus on providing support to people who are now having to undertake work from home, like many of us on the call today. We have seen that 7 out of 10 employees say that they feel confident that their organisation will support them if they face personal difficulties. Out of all the questions, and we asked around about 20 or so different employee experience questions for these for people that we were polling over the last couple of months, this was actually the lowest scoring item. So it tells us that there's still some improvement that's required in terms of how organisations instill this sense of confidence that as people confront any sort of personal challenge or personal difficulty, and that can show up in a variety of different ways. It could show up as a mental health challenge. It could show up in a personal challenge. It could show up in a challenge that people have around balancing work life, given it's all being kind of mushed together at the moment. We've got lots of people working from home and having to homeschool children in countries where kids aren't yet back at school. So there's still 30% of people that don't feel fully confident that their organisation is going to be there to support them if they face a really serious personal issue. We're also seeing some other really important themes show up in the data set. So this notion of stress and health is becoming really important. So people are 3.5 times more likely to talk about stress and health and safety in a negative way, where they don't feel that the organisation is focused on putting people's safety and wellness at the top of the priority list. So that becomes really important, that if an organisation isn't seen to be focused on the wellness and well-being of their colleagues, then people are substantially less positive around how that organisation is managing employee stress and being seen to be prioritising the health and safety of their people through this crisis. What's also interesting is that I think as the pace of change, as I look back to March and April and even into February for countries that were at the forefront of this crisis, and it'll be great for us to hear from Audrey soon, who represents our business in China, who was obviously at the forefront of this crisis. I think companies were just forced into taking very quick decisions, which meant we were taking one-size-fits-all solutions and strategies simply because we probably had no other choice. But we are starting to see that the experience of different demographic segments is playing out differently. So we're starting to see, as an example here on screen, is that there's some slightly different perceptions when you look at the data between females and males in terms of how organisations are helping people to manage their stress levels through the crisis. And we've got some interesting data to show you in a moment that might help give some food for thought for why it is that females and males are starting to have some different perceptions around how organisations are helping them from a stress management perspective. But coming into the crisis, it was very difficult to take anything but a one-size-fits-all approach. But coming out of the crisis, we're definitely going to have to start to segment the workforce a little bit more. We also asked people, what do they need? We've never been in a situation like this before. So I think it's important that we hear from people around the kind of support that they need. And there were 3 big clusters of responses. So people were telling us that they needed a lot of support, a lot of information from leaders. And I think that makes really good sense. And the good news is that by and large, people are very, very favourable in the feedback that they've got for leaders around information flow, consistency of messages. We've seen leaders embrace a variety of different modes of communication. In-person town halls, just not possible. So we're seeing a more blended approach to email, social media, video, conference calls, et cetera, and I think that's been great. More frequent than less frequent is definitely the preference of people. We just don't want to leave people in the dark. Ambiguity is our enemy at the moment. So it's important that people are receiving frequent information, lots of updates, high levels of transparency, lots of candor, lots of authenticity, and a huge amount of empathy. That's definitely what people are responding best to. We're also seeing this big shift around policies and guidelines. And I think this is an interesting one, and we'll probably see this dynamic evolve over time. We definitely saw organizations have to act first and almost document and develop policy second. The sheer pace of change in this pandemic through February, March, and April meant that companies were simply taking action literally with one day's notice. And so for companies that maybe before the crisis had very bureaucratic, very data-driven methods of decision-making, it was a real challenge. But as we get more experience with the crisis, we're definitely going to start to see a greater need for added support, added frameworks, added guidelines. But it doesn't necessarily mean that we have to revert to pre-COVID crisis ways of making decisions, and even pre-COVID crisis norms and assumptions about how work gets done and where work gets done. We've definitely seen that virtual working can work. Doesn't mean it necessarily needs to stay this way, but it certainly can now become more of an option for more people, particularly in cultures and countries where perhaps it just wasn't as prevalent as others globally. And that becomes really important as well. So let's keep advancing. I made this point about starting to think about how you segment the organization, and Elias touched on this notion of moments that matter for segments that matter. And I think this is going to become increasingly important for organizations as we live through this crisis. We learn more about how to lead people through the crisis, and we hopefully start to get to a post-crisis world pretty quickly. This is some interesting data here where we looked at the age demographic that's probably most likely to be doing the really delicate balance of working from home and homeschooling of individuals. So folks in the 35 to 44 year category. It's obviously not just with that group, but a lot of that group will be faced with that challenge. And then we segmented the data for men versus males versus females. We found a lot of common experiences that this group is talking about, but one that sort of shows up very differently is this notion of family and caring for children. So both groups talked about that as a challenge, but it certainly came out to be more prevalent for the female demographic. So, we don't want to play stereotypes here, and we don't want to generalize too much, but, maybe this plays to this theme of so many people having to homeschool, so many people having to work from home and balance all the normal caring commitments that we have for our kids. And it's certainly playing out to be more of an issue for more females than it has played up for the male demographic. So we just use this as an example that as we gain more experience with the crisis, we're going to have to start to think about segmenting our organization a little bit more, because the issues are starting to play out differently for different workforce segments. And I think that becomes a big part of the answer moving forwards. So I want to get you to some actions and some answers to give you some food for thought inside of your own organizational responses. Maybe just one more data point as we think about regional differentiation, given we've got a global audience today. Through our feedback surveys of colleagues in the last couple of months, we've really focused on these 4 big experiences that I've talked a little bit about today. So experiences around how an organization has showed concern for its people and helping people to feel connected in a virtual world, health, safety, wellness, information and communication from senior leaders, and the effectiveness and support around virtual work. We do find a lot of consistency in a lot of response patterns. There's probably 2 I'd call out today. We'll have a lot of people on the call representing the Middle East, North Africa, Sub-Sahara group. And we have found that for that group, the focus on health, safety and wellness was the lowest scoring category of experiences, if you like. So that might just give us pause to reflect and think about what more can we be doing inside of our organizations to demonstrate that we're placing colleague health, safety and wellness at the top of our list of experiences that we're trying to help and nurture people through. And then in Asia Pacific, it's been interesting that virtual work effectiveness is comfortably the lowest scoring item. I might hypothesize that there's probably a number of countries and cultures through Asia where virtual work and work from home may be not as prevalent as it has been for other cultures. So perhaps that's meant that organizations have had to kind of fast track their learnings and help people really rapidly adapt and embrace to more working from home. So again, useful data that just gives us food for thought for how these issues play out differently in different countries. So let's start to think about, what do you do? How do we make sense of all of this? And how do we start to think about some different actions ongoing now that we're getting more experience through the crisis? So the point of our message here today is to take an employee experience-led approach. Coming into the crisis, a lot of organizations were already focusing on their employee experience. It was starting to become the norm, and all of our data was indicating that organizations that were really focused on creating a world-class employee experience, they were reaping the benefits with respect to return on their investment. And we were seeing that show up in accelerated revenue growth, accelerated profit growth, more satisfied customers, et cetera, et cetera. And you can see that in a variety of different means here on screen. We definitely expect to see that show up as well coming out of the crisis. I think what we also want to see is that it creates benefits for organizations in broader areas than just commercial return. That's going to be important, but we also want to see it show up in other areas around improved safety scores for organizations and improved health and wellness ratings for organizations, because that's going to be so important over the coming months. Now let's start to think about ways in which you can take some practical actions inside of your organization. And there's a few things that I'll leave you with behind to think about for your organization. The first part is to really start to think about how you segment your organization. I think the crisis forced us to take a one-size-fits-all approach because the speed of change was so rapid. But I think our response ongoing has got to be a little bit more segmented. So we would argue the way to do that is to think about what are the moments that matter most for the segments that matter most inside of your organization. Now, coming into the crisis, the moments that mattered and the segments that mattered most were at the top left of this heat map. So our traditional approach pre-crisis would have been to think about our high potential talent, our high performing talent, people on our leadership pipeline and people facing customers. We put a disproportionate amount of effort into that demographic and those segments. And we wanted to create for them great experiences around performance management, great experiences around making sure they were really aligned with strategy, great experiences around being recognized and rewarded for all the great work this segment was doing. The COVID crisis has fundamentally changed how we think about this. We have different segments that matter now. Some of our most important segments are those that fall into the essential worker category. Definitely people that are facing customers, definitely people who are at the front line in blue collar roles have become, and they're essential workers, so they become a critical talent segment. And now we've got this remote worker segment that's become really important, and many of us have now become a remote worker as we're all working from home. And different moments are now mattering as we think about what are the experiences we need people to have a really good experience with at the moment. So different moments that matter are coming up. It's much more about health, safety, and wellness. It's much more about the experience with technology. It's much more about the mitigation of enterprise risk to an organization. So we use this tool with all of our clients to get our clients thinking about, as you action and evolve your HR processes and strategies coming out of the crisis, who are the segments that matter most in your talent profile right now? And what are the moments that matter for those people? And that's where you zero in in your focus areas. Doesn't mean you forget everybody else, but it means this is where you put a disproportionate amount of your time and your investments. So that's one framework and tool that we'll leave behind for everybody. I also want to give everybody a really practical action plan. So 4 points that I'll leave behind for everybody to think about in your action plan coming out of today. And the first one really builds on what I've just said. It's important to take a really strategic view to your employee experience coming out of this crisis. So definitely think inside of your organization, who are my talent segments that matter the most right now? And what are the moments that matter the most for them right now? And that's where you focus a lot of your time and attention. Part one. Part two, it's time to think differently about what we need from leaders. In the crisis, we are definitely seeing that the leadership styles that people are naturally craving and gravitating towards are leadership styles that are high on empathy, personal connection, ability to lead people through change and ambiguity, balancing the short term and the long term. And the short term might simply be tomorrow, but also connecting people through to vision and where you want to take your organization. It's a great opportunity to reconnect people with purpose. So I think leaders that lead with purpose will be very well received, and leaders that really dial up colleague care and concern. What we also need to make sure is that perhaps as the situation stabilizes, leaders cannot revert to pre-COVID weaknesses. People are going to judge those leaders really harshly. I think a new expectation and a heightened standard has been set around visibility, access to information, and leaders being seen to be leading with people at the forefront of their thinking. That has to hold true now, ongoing. That's got to be the new normal. And we think that's really, really important. With respect to those of you on the call who might be in HR roles or working with HR colleagues, I think it's really important to reset some HR disciplines. HR has to be at the forefront of taking an employee experience-led approach. That's going to be really, really important. HR has to be at the forefront of gathering and actioning feedback from employees. So it can't be a notion of HR forcing policy and process onto people. I think if we're going to do this in a really employee experience way, design thinking techniques would tell us that you involve your end user group in the design and deployment of great processes that create great experiences. So I think HR needs to be at the forefront of listening and gathering feedback and using that to shape processes and policies. And I think HR's got to be more agile than ever. Investment for HR services is going to be very different through the crisis and coming out of the crisis. So HR is going to have to be a lot more agile in people strategy. Strategy and initiatives and investments are going to be constantly reviewed. So I think the HR function has to be more nimble and take more of an agile approach to the development and implementation of people and talent strategies. And then I think fourth, feedback is going to be really, really important. We've seen a big shift towards our clients wanting to start to embrace more continuous feedback, more frequent feedback, and feedback around critical experiences that matter right now. So we just recently helped give a voice to over 1 million workers globally in their experience of being led through this crisis. And they were in experiences that were critical to what people were having in March, April, and May. We're already starting to think about what are the experiences that people are going to have in June, July, and August, perhaps as some people start to return to the office and return to work. So I'd encourage everybody to be thinking about what's the sort of feedback that you need, and how do you get really rapid cycles to gather feedback and action feedback. So that's really important. So I'll leave you with those 4 points as the 4-point action plan for everybody to think about and reflect on coming out of this conversation. I'm really keen that you get to hear from Audrey. Audrey's got some fantastic insights that at Kincentric we've all learned from how our colleagues have been led through this crisis in China. Just before we get to that, we've got one final polling question that we want to share with all of you. in the spirit of some action learning and taking feedback or taking insights from the webinar and helping you to apply this back into your organization. So moderator, if we can just display the third poll, thanks. And then Elias, I'll turn it back to you. So if we think about those 4 to 5 areas of the action plan that I just shared, we'd be interested to hear from you what resonates the most. So what 2 areas should your organization focus on in the post-COVID era to unleash productivity through a big focus on creating a great experience for people? So is it about employee experience strategies and how you think about moments that matter for segments that matter? Is it about revisiting leadership models for the future and how you think about what you need from leaders? Is it about a different set of capabilities and focus areas and agility inside of the HR function? Is it about embracing more continuous feedback from people? And is it about how you measure very specific experiences for those moments that matter and segments that matter that I talked about previously? So I'd be really curious to see where the participant group is at based on what we've recommended you take away from the session, and then we'll see the results, and I'll pass you back to Elias and Audrey. So maybe 10 more seconds here. We'll just capture those first initial reactions. Maybe moderator, we can close the poll and see what resonates most with people on the call. Let's see. So big focus on building talent and employee experience strategies. That's great to hear. We would agree. That's extremely important. And as you think about that, I'd encourage everybody to think about as you're making a decision, as you're designing a policy, as you're designing an organizational intervention, think about how can we use that intervention to create some sense of employee experience outcome. So is it an initiative that's all about creating more positive connections between people? Is it about creating some heightened sense of inspiration? Is it about creating a greater sense of pride and advocacy in the organization? Or is it about removing friction from some sort of policy or process that's frustrating people? If you can keep those 4 employee experience outcomes front in mind, it's a great way to be designing talent and HR strategies and implementing them through your organization. And good to see that revisiting the role of leadership and dialing up those leadership styles of empathy, balancing short and long term, displaying care and concern. We think those are going to be really important leadership traits into the future. So that's great to hear, and hopefully some of that advice is helpful for all of you. Elias, I'll turn it back to you and Audrey now.
Thank you very much, Steve, for your insights. So, team, we thought that Audrey would be able to bring us a lot of insights also from China. And let me moderate that discussion. Audrey, how can you describe the employee experience during COVID-19 period in China?
Elias, first of all, thank you very much for having me on this discussion. And I think it's good afternoon to everyone. It's the question that you've asked, and it's how would you describe the employee experience, right, during the pandemic period in China? I think looking back, and we'd like to think that we're already in a post-pandemic, although we're still monitoring it very closely. But looking back, what we see is, I think employees, no matter which industries you are in, have all been experiencing a lot of stress, a lot of stress coming from uncertainties, a lot of anxiety about what the future is going to look like. What about my job safety? Will my income be affected? And all that. And if you just go back to last year before the pandemic, I mean, everyone is, it's very common to hear that people are feeling stress as well. But the stress was coming from high workload, fast growth. We can't catch up fast enough. So it's a stress, but in a different kind of angle. It's more about catching up, making the most of it. Whereas now or the last few months, and I think I can see it going forward as well, it's about stress related to the uncertainties surrounding the economy, surrounding the market, and that has brought a lot of mental health stress. And then, as at the very beginning, you also mentioned that people see a lot of some people may experience some depression, anxiety, loneliness, and all that. So altogether, that's essentially what we are seeing. But at the same time, if we are looking at just these segments, we need to also be aware that the people, if you're looking at the workplaces, people who are leading the employees, so the managers, the leaders, for them, it's been a different experience as well. The experience has been, for leaders, this is new. This is unprecedented. We thought it would be as bad as the 2009 financial crisis, but this is worse than that. And how do we figure out a way forward? And especially we see also among the young leaders or young managers, this is even where the experience part just is, there's just no prior experience with that. And in China specifically, we see a lot of young managers are still trying to, grow or trying to build up their leadership experience, leadership capability. So when you add that, complicate that with this situation, it could be quite challenging. And for HR, where the concern has always been about attracting talent, retaining talent, making sure people are productive, suddenly you have this health and safety of employees become front and center. So the physical safety, not only at the workplace, but also outside of work. How do you deal with this? So how do you, as the HR community, really, your own experience, and then how do you also ensure that the employee experience are actually something that's more positive in such a distressing time? So that's a long answer to your question, right?
So Audrey, thank you very much. I believe the audience in the Middle East would be a little bit interested to understand then what is the current situation now in China? What is the new normal for the Chinese organizations? You're ahead of the rest of the world in many different ways. So what's the new normal in China at the moment?
That's a good question, Elias. I think the new normal is still being defined. And as we speak, it's continuously being refined. So there's a lot of unknown. And I think I've spoken to many of our clients and many organizations here. I think there is a consensus that, yes, there is a lot of unknown, and it's probably a lot more unknown that we have not even thought about before. And yet there is a resolution, or there's a will to say that we are going to get out of this. We are going to recover, even though it's going to be very slow. And so we have seen, I think most industries, not just the worst affected industries, but even across industries like pharmaceutical, where it tends to be a bit better, or some of the internet companies also better. And there's still this taking this very realistic view. So it's not bullish. It's more about, wanting to make sure that things will get better. Now, having said that, if I may add just a few more details to it, we see that the economy has, of course, declined in terms of the GDP versus previous year. Recently, the Chinese premier even declined to, announce or set a growth target for the country, which is something that never happened before. It's because once you set that target, you have to achieve it. So if you don't set that target or don't make it official, this means it's something that is still being reviewed at. But we also see positive signs of recovery. We see the service sector, like or the retail sector, for instance, whether it's Starbucks opening, nearly all its stores. Disney Shanghai opened in mid-May. They still impose social distancing, so not 100% capacity, but people are visiting, and you have, even luxury brands like Hermes returning to normal. You know, and what we see is interestingly not just as the service sector or the retail sector, or but also, you know, the airlines are, you know, flying more flights, and the hotels are filling up. So it's good sign. This is when there's a very strong backdrop, in the sense that, you know, if you have this under control or more or less contained, people will feel a bit safer. So I just traveled to Beijing yesterday, and I mean, we talk about whether there's the middle seat should be, you know, should not be filled out and all that. But, you know, like you see that middle seats are filling up. Out of 200 plus seats, you know, 185 seats were filled out. And I mean, this is just a very small example, but where you're seeing that people starting to live normal life. But there's always this caution on, you know, whether it's about wearing masks, whether it's about, you know, extra sanitizing. People are doing that. And another thing we see is in terms of changes in some industries, you know, like I think manufacturing. China has been known for its manufacturing. I think another thing that is critical is the supply chains in China actually experience a lot of, you know, a lot of stress during the pandemic. So production and its distribution have been really interrupted. But this is something that what we see the manufacturing sector as well, the supply chain, they've been trying a more proactive thing. So that goes to, one is the digitalization, where in China it's been already and quite ahead of many other markets, but also the usage or pushing of things like you know, robotics in manufacturing setting, the use of AI. So I think a lot of organizations are using this as a chance to reset and say what we wanted to do, like maybe 6 months later or 2 years later, we have to accelerate. So this is happening, and consumer behaviors are also changing. You have, for instance, people are shopping more online, and we're not talking about the young people sector. We're now talking about the older generation, people who are, you know, grandpas and grandmas who would never shop online before, and now they're switching to this type. Now, this is behavior that is unlikely to revert back to pre-COVID time. And so a lot of industries, you have, you know, we're seeing that they're dealing with all these changes and trying to figure out the way forward.
Thank you. So something that I wanted to elaborate on, you mentioned that you've been talking to CEOs and CHROs and getting the pulse of the organization. Just to close, maybe in 2 minutes maximum, what's high on the agenda of the Chinese CEOs and CHROs at this moment in time? And what are they planning in terms of their employee experience in the new era?
Okay. So just very quickly, the 3 major learnings, or what the CHROs and high on the agenda, I think it's a recovery and setting recovery strategy, whether it's about cash flow, cost savings, productivity, or a combination thereof. That's one. And I think boosting agility in the organization, it's critical for many. So it's whether it's structure, it's capability, it's headcounts. Another thing we see is also digital solutions. So there is a greater openness and a greater motivation to move to having digital solutions, not only for like how you work, you know, virtual working and all that, but also in serving your customers. And I think the final thing is just really driving workforce productivity. This is something that has, in China, even before COVID, there's a lot of talk about efficiency, productivity, and this is even more pronounced now. And you asked, I think the next question is, what are they planning in terms of the employee experience? I think it's also the recognition that people are very important. That's not necessarily the case before. But you know, this has become the forefront, and so there's more consideration about the employees, not only their health and safety, but also the experience in going forward. So I think what Steven talked about earlier is the care and concern, and then how do you actually connect with them becomes really critical for employee experience going forward. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Audrey. That was really insightful, and it gave it a different perspective. For the audience who are on the call, we are more than happy now to answer your questions. Stephen and Audrey would be happy to answer any questions you might be having. So if you can key your questions in the chat box on your screen, and our colleagues from Manchester University would be more than happy to moderate the Q&A.
Thank you, Elias, Stephen, and Audrey. I am just waiting for the audience to share the questions, which I can then read out for you. For the audience, you have a question or a chat box on your screen in the panel. You can please write down your questions or anything which you would like to ask the panel, and you can write it down there, and we can pick that question up right away. Okay, great. So we have our first question from Arun Sharma. Do you think organizational structure will not revert back to the pre-COVID era? Can organizational culture be changed in such a fast-forward manner? Elias, if you can.
I'm happy to take that one, if we like.
Perfect.
I think it's a great question. So probably a few ways to look at it. If we think about this firstly from a cultural perspective, or rather, let's step it back from culture for a sec. Definitely COVID-19 is going to be an accelerant for changes that possibly would have already happened. So, you know, we've seen that play out in a lot of different ways, and big crises tend to do that. They tend to just be an accelerant for changes that in many situations may have already taken place. I think we'll start to see that in a lot of what we've talked about today. So the response that organizations have taken around leadership styles, there's little in that we don't already know to be important. So you know, any good leadership textbook is going to tell you that leading with empathy, leading with purpose, leading with connection, the ability to lead people through ambiguity, these are fundamentally critical leadership traits. I think what the COVID-19 crisis has done, it's given leaders no option really but to lead with those sorts of styles. So the question now becomes, how do you lock that in, and how do leaders continue to operate at that high level of standard in those leadership styles? The same is true on the employee experience side of things. We know from our research that nearly 80% of organizations in 2019 reported that they strongly believed that investing in employee experience would have a positive impact and return for their organization. So we already knew it to be true. The COVID-19 crisis has forced us to really double down and think heavily about the kind of experiences that people are going to have and the kind of experiences that we want people to have inside of our organization. So again, I think we sort of argue there was no choice but to embrace that. So that becomes an accelerant for change. I think on the cultural side of things, what we'd see, and if I think about the way that as an organization we think about culture really across 8 different styles. So styles of ranging from authority to caring, enjoyment, learning, order, purpose, results, and safety. They're the 8 styles that we see when we work with clients around cultural measurement and cultural change. I suspect what the crisis is going to do is act for an accelerant around culture change in the areas of certainly purpose. I think a lot of organizations are using this as an opportunity to reflect on their purpose and reconnect people with their purpose. I'll give you a really practical example. A couple of weeks ago, I was with a client executive team, and they found that when we asked people what experiences in the workplace shape you feeling inspired and motivated by your organization. And so people told us a lot of stories about their colleagues, about their team, and about their direct manager, that experiences in those three areas were the biggest source of inspiration and motivation for people. When then talking about that with the executive team, everyone kind of found that good and useful, but then quickly the conversation moved to, yeah, but what if people were also really inspired and motivated by our higher order purpose, by the contribution and impact that we make in the lives of our community and the people that we serve and our customers. So I think what we're finding is that the crisis is giving us that ability to reconnect people with the purpose of the organization. And so I expect to see that becomes a really strong accelerant for cultural change inside of our clients. Again, there's nothing new in that. But I can see COVID-19 really forcing organizations to think about how we reconnect people back to purpose, and especially people in essential worker roles. You know, if you're putting yourself at harm's way, you want to know that the work that you are doing is contributing to some higher order need and higher order benefit that is positively impacting on a lot of people. And healthcare workers are doing that right now. They're all helping to keep us safe and healthy. I was working with a telecommunications company a little while ago, and all of their technical engineers, we were encouraging them to think about, if you're a technical engineer working on the poles and wires of a telco, you are helping millions of people homeschool and educate kids at home through providing high quality, high speed internet bandwidth into the homes of millions of families. That's all about this notion of culture change and connecting people to purpose and the impact of their work. So I think that's how we'll start to see it show up. I think it's a great question. Audrey, Elias, anything you want to add to that as well?
Yeah, if I may, just one example, recent example, in fact, you know, one of the things, the culture aspect of it, how do you change it? I think we've seen organizations seeing this as an opportunity to become, for instance, to build stronger trust within the organization, or, you know, if they are trying to have flexible working hours or virtual working hours, they take baby steps, but they're moving it in the direction that they want it to be, because it actually provided a really good opportunity for them to move this forward. So an organization that really values, you know, a lot of in-person interaction, for instance, has used this as an opportunity to review their practices, their work practice, and say, we still want to retain that, but, you know, let's give more flexibility. You know, maybe just and what about the frontline workers? You know, they don't necessarily have to be in the office, but when they're in the office, then why do we need the face-to-face interaction for? So it's really challenging us, you know, existing assumptions and coming back with a better way of doing things that can actually support the building of their culture.
Great. Totally agree with you both, Stephen and Audrey, because employees are also building up some kind of an expectation while everyone is moving back to the new normal. And I think that's where such an employee experience will play a major impact in the overall organizational growth as well. On the similar note, I have another question being asked by Minna. I'll read it out for you all. How can you create a positive employee experience when you will have to make difficult choices that ensures the sustainability of the business, which would inevitably lead to course adjustment impacting the employee experience?
Yeah, that's a great question. Maybe I can lead off again, and we'll turn it over to everybody. Yeah, and maybe like I'd bring us right back to sort of one of the early areas where I started. If we think about the science of experiences, so you know we know that not all experiences are positive. So there are experiences around. They show up in moments of milestones. They show up in moments of transitions. They show up in moments of peaks, and they show up in moments of pits. So not all experiences are positive. And also, when we think about that sort of two criteria which defines a defining experience, they're memorable and meaningful. Again, they don't have to be positive. Things can be meaningful and memorable because of the negative impact that they had. So I think that's the first thing, is that, you know, we're trying to amplify the positive experiences and manage the pits or the negative experiences. The sheer reality, and I think the tragedy of this crisis, is that there is a lot of negative experiences going on, whether it's around, you know, just sadly the sheer number of people that have lost their lives, and so therefore the number of family and friends that are impacted by that, the number of people that have become sick, the number of people that have lost jobs or you know, having to work through a situation where their role is a lot less secure than before. It's a terrible set of circumstances. But I think, again, it's sort of where we can lean on how do we create positive experiences, and it's in those areas of connection, pride, insight, and the removal of friction. So, you know, maybe an example is the reality for a lot of organizations is they've sadly had to reduce the size of their teams, and that's never a nice thing to do. But you can still do it respectfully. You can still do it with a lot of trust and a lot of respect for people. And that can actually act as a force to drive this greater sense of connection in the workforce. So in that respect, you can take a terrible experience for a lot of people, but maybe in the balance of time, people look back on that and go, you know what, that actually enabled us to forge greater relationships. We got to see leaders as people. The organization was brought together. So you're looking at employee experience through the lens of this greater sense of connection that is for, and relationships that are forged between people. This element of removal of friction as well. It possibly wasn't a great thing that so many people were forced to work from home. I've got 3 young kids, and gosh, it was mayhem at times in our house. Homeschooling, trying to do my job, all this sorts of stuff. It was really, really tough. But that's where the organization is thinking about, how can we remove as much friction in that process as possible? How can we make it as easy as possible for people to work through that? I certainly am very thankful for the lengths that my organization went to kind of make that experience as least bad as possible. Maybe it's not something that becomes a raging positive, but I certainly am full of admiration for the efforts our company went to make it as least bad and as least disruptive as possible. And then as we start to spin out of this, as we're making decisions, that's where I just think, if in our decision-making criteria, if we're always thinking, how can I use this decision to create a better experience for people? We're going to be you're going to make more better decisions, and you're going to create more better experiences than if we weren't thinking about it in a very deliberate way about the impact on the colleague experience. Elias, Audrey, anything you'd like to add?
I'll just go ahead, Audrey.
Okay, and Elias, I'll take you on that one. So I'll just as I think Stephen mentioned earlier about how to make this meaningful, the employee experience meaningful. I think when you think about what we are trying to do, or you know, the employee experience itself is not just positive, negative, but it's also meaningful, and whether it leads to more growth, more development. And if we're looking from it, some of the things that we do, for instance, in terms of leadership development, where we do a lot of our work, it's, you know, what are the defining experiences? What are the critical experiences that they need to go through? And that could include, you know, going through overcoming difficult challenges like this and still bringing your team or the people together, you know. So that's one thing. So thinking of the meaningful aspect of it and growth. And I think also for employees, when you're having to adjust, whether it's restructuring, whether it's pay adjustments, or whether it's any other types of business corrections that you have to do, and with impact on employees, is the fact that what do they will they actually get some positive things out of it, you know, aside from the, you know, the maybe it's a loss of job, maybe it's a loss of opportunity, it's a loss of income, but you know, how is that experience translated for the future, and are they feeling supported? Are they feeling, as Stephen mentioned, respected? Are they feeling cared about? So this is, I think this is the differentiator versus just positive and negative. So that's what I wanted to add. And Elias, I'm sure you have more to say on this.
No, I'll just comment in 30 seconds. Back in 2009, during the economic recession, I was heading HR for a large organization. And in my region, I had to let go 160 people during a matter of 2 months. The process at that time was focused on legal. It has a legal perspective. It had an HRN process perspective. What's happening in 2020 and with a lot of organizations is different. The legal and the HR perspectives are still there. However, the way the organizations are executing it is totally different. They're looking into the overall employee experience. And it's not only the experience of the people who are leaving, but equally the people who are being retained and staying within the organization. So we've seen a lot of more communication happening within the organizations ahead of time. Organizations are communicating their strategy and they're explaining the reasons for the decisions vis-a-vis that strategy. They're doing it in utmost fairness, or as much as possible, as fair as possible. I heard it from a lot of my colleagues when they came back and told me that they've been furloughed at this moment in time. But they said, I've been explained and I understand why. And if I was in their position, maybe I would have taken the same decision. So there is a lot of support that's also coming from the organizations for the people who are leaving and for the people who are being retained. So definitely it is a tough decision, but if it's done appropriately, if you're taking care of the colleagues who are leaving as well as the colleagues who are being retained, the experience is going to be totally different.
Exactly, and that is the human connect, which has become extremely important at this moment, wherein we have to share that empathetic approach towards the losses and the gains. We have to equate it out. As very well said by one of you, that the employee experience, a lot has been done by the industry to maintain and retain the employee experience, and indeed technology is playing a very major role in that. So the next question in queue is related around this, because the COVID-based transformation has been primarily technology-led. So the question comes from Arun. Had technological solutions not been available so easily, it would have been next to impossible to maintain the level of efficiency and connectivity. So do you envisage that technology will continue to lead transformations in the future? Or do you see other catalysts emerging as well?
So if I may take the question first, I think the view from here in China is that yes, technology is definitely going to be critical. It's right now, I think for many of us living in China, it's impossible to think that we don't have the technology. Whether it's from having your health code, on your smart app, on your phone, and then say, I'm okay, I've traveled in the past 14 days to the cities which are not affected. Or in the future, it's like everything is going to be offline, online, interconnected. So the omni-channel kind of concept would be being pushed and would grow even faster. Are there any other catalysts? I don't see any at the moment. It doesn't mean there is any. So maybe Elias and Stephen, you could perhaps share your views as well. But I'm sure that technology would definitely play a very important role going forward. It will be changing the landscape. Yeah.
Yeah, I maybe offer up a sort of slightly maybe a slightly different point of view around. I think technology is going to be important, but I certainly subscribe to the theory that organizations don't change, but people do from within those organizations. And I think that the technology is going to continue to be the big enabler of the change, but I don't think it will necessarily be the catalyst for continued transformation. And even through this crisis, technology's been the enabler, but it's not been the need. The need has been very people-centric. So I actually think the big protagonist for ongoing change is going to be all about getting back to putting people at the center of how organizations think and operate. And we've seen this recently. I can't remember, the name escapes me, but last year there was the group of heavy-hitting CEOs in the United States of all the biggest companies in the US who came out and said that organizations need to move from shareholder as the primary reason for being, to think more broadly about impact on community and the broader stakeholder group and impact on society. And that was coming from the CEOs of some of the biggest organizations in the United States. So I think that's going to be the big sort of protagonist for change. I think technology will continue to accelerate the pace of it, and technology enables it to happen at scale and at speed. So I think that's going to be the role of technology. But even through the crisis, the need has been on connection. How we've done it is through technology. But I think I'd encourage everybody to think different. There's the need, and then there's the how we enable it. And technology is the how we enable it. But I think transformation is just going to be accelerated through people, and how people need to change how we think and how we act and how we behave, and to what we're contributing towards inside of our organizations.
Okay, perfect. Perfect. On that note, we have come to the end of this session. I would like to thank Elias, Stephen, Audrey for your wonderful thoughts and presentation, addressing the questions which came up. And it is indeed quite insightful, because employee experience itself is bold and italics in today's scenario, and there is a lot of interest in the market, in the industry, and each one of us is contributing to this experience in one or the other way. I'm also thankful to the audience who joined us today for this webinar, and I hope you also have an equated experience attending this webinar. Thank you once again to all of you, Elias, Stephen, and Audrey, and the audience. If you will be receiving the recording of this webinar shortly, and you can visit our website www.manchester.ac.ae for more information and for more such events on the way. Once again, stay safe, everyone. Thank you so much for coming online. Take care.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.